This is Past Perfect, CEU Medieval Radio's program on medieval and early modern history and culture, in association with Civil Radio FM 98.
Hello there, this is Christopher Mielke, and I am your host of Past Perfect. This is CEU Medieval Radio's show in medieval and early modern history and culture, in association with Civil Radio FM 98. Today we're joined by Dr. Péter Szabó. Dr. Szabó is a researcher at the Institute of Botany at the Czech Academy of Sciences. Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So, I wanted to have you on the show because your main work that you're known for is your 2005 monograph on woodlands and forests in medieval Hungary. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about in the first portion of this interview is how do you research medieval forests? How do you go about finding information about them?
You have to know your sources. You have to know what you're looking for, and then see if there's anything you can do about it.
Okay,
Depends where you are.
So
if you're German, then you have a relatively easy position. If you're Romanian, you have a very difficult position. Hungary is somewhere in between. There is some information about the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, but it's not all that much.
So what sort of documents tell us about these forests?
Nowadays, where I work is this kind of Central European region.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be something. We don't get the kind of documentation that you would normally use if you were German or English or French even, which should be some sort of financial documentation.
Okay.
I don't know how straightforward this sounds, but that's the best kind of information you get, because maybe we should say this at the very beginning, that I'm interested in the actual landscape. I'm interested in the trees that there are. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight might be an interesting topic, but that does not concern me. So if you're interested in the actual trees and the vegetation and the stuff that's in the landscape, then the best kind of documentation you can get is economic, because that's where they were dealing with the stuff. So let's say if you're English, then you take 13th century account books of manorial account books, and you take a look at the woodland entries. So they would say, well, we have this kind of woodland, and we cut this and that much 1 year, and I don't know, there are oak trees and ash trees there, and this is wonderful. I have no idea how wonderful this sounds to an outsider, but I find that I find it wonderful. And if you have a lot of this kind of information, which they do, for example, then you can do wonderful research. There's a great paper called Fueling the City. It's about the around 1300, I think. It's the fuel wood supply of London around 1300 AD. Where it was coming from, what they were doing there, and they have a lot of documentation, this kind of stuff. Okay, but if you're Hungarian, this just won't happen. Virtually, there are no medieval account books. Well, there are some, but and the other problem is how to put this. The landscape, from a medieval perspective, the landscape is not an interesting subject. They wouldn't really write about it too much. Mm-hmm. It enters the sources when it kind of gets a value for something, such as an economic value. Then they would say, okay, fine, and we would start writing about it. But if it works more or less the way it worked in Hungary, that it's outside the scope of anybody's interest who writes, then you just don't get the sources. A lot of things were going on, but you don't get to find out. So you're in this position where you're looking for at least some sort of source that will tell you something. And now, for Hungary, I had two kinds that are the most important. One of them is called a perambulation, and the other one is called an estimation. Let's start with the estimation. That's more straightforward. Estimation is basically going and looking at someone's property, estate, and saying how much it's worth, because you need to express the amount in money, basically, because something happened. I don't know, he committed high treason, or now we're confiscating everything and 1/3 has to go to the judge, and so on. So you need to know how much it's worth. Or issues of inheritance, once again, is the same. Okay, we give her 1/4, but how much is it? Mm-hmm. So this is what I was talking about. This is where the landscape enters into the sources. There's some sort of an other interest. For example, now I need to know how much it's worth. Okay, so this is one kind of source that was produced in some sort of quantity. I have data for something like 300,000. The Carpathian Basin is 300,000 square kilometers, and I have data for 1%. So
oh my
you
goodness.
you do the math.
Oh my goodness.
It's still quite a lot. So at least I have a basic. Oh, I forgot to mention what's in it. Okay, yes. So what's in it? In it, there is a description of this estate in very basic terms. There is this and that much arable land, meadows, woodland, fields, sometimes pasture, sometimes it was left out. And then they say what kind and how big and how much it's worth. This is nice. It's all from the 15th century, most of it for Hungary. So this is one kind, and I had a look at lots of sources, and then I stopped actually, what's almost 10 years ago now. I should go back and look, because now all the sources are on the internet, so I should probably go back and look at the rest.
Yeah.
And the other kind of source is something called a perambulation. Perambulation is, it's a wonderful kind of source. It's very mysterious. It happens to be the same all over the world in all sorts of periods. Maybe it's some human necessity. It's the pre-map equivalent of a map. They said, okay, this is your land, this is my land. We need to know where the boundary is. These are very basic needs. So they just go and say, here, we turn left, we saw that.
They're walking around doing
Yeah,
this.
they're walking. That's what it's. Yeah, you're right. That's why it's called perambulatio. They're walking around. So they say, okay, well, we turned left here and saw the anthill, and then we walked on through this valley and up the hill again, which is called this and that. And it's very, very, very similar. There are further similarities, even in the procedure, but that gets into the mysterious side of the issue that I don't really understand. No, I mean, the laws of Manu, it's 2,000 years old at least. I don't know, they tell me. It's exactly the same procedure as you would find in 19th century Hungary. I don't think the connection is very direct, but it's there. Anyway, so there are lots of trees in such documents, and lots of forests as well. This is something, once again, you can use.
Do you have a lot of data for the perambulations?
Oh yes, there's lots. I did estimates once again of how many there could be based on a smaller sample. Now that I work with the natural scientists, I actually know how I should have done it to come up with the normal number. But I did come up with the number of 10,000, I think.
Square kilometers?
No, 10,000 perambulations for the Carpathian Basin. I might be completely off, but certainly there are several thousand. That's Hungary. I mean, the medieval Hungary only. So, and they're all over Europe, everywhere, in all sorts of periods.
Sure.
If you look at Europe and perambulations, there were tens of thousands, and then very many.
You mentioned that you're interested in the landscape aspect of this, which I think is something that I really want to hash out a bit. When they're going on these walks or making these estimates, what exactly are they seeing? Just generally, or you can give a few case studies if you like.
You want to know what examples of what they saw?
Sure, where they we turned left at this one blasted tree.
There would be a lot of that. The point in a perambulation is to, we would think at least, is to come up with a landmark that will be recognizable later on as well.
Okay, naturally.
The blasted tree, or the tree with the huge trunk, or they would also add signs, usually a cross, to the tree. So they would say, we went to the tree with the cross. They would even go into details. We went to this tree which earlier had the cross, but it was hardly visible, so we renewed it, and so on. There would be lots of this stuff, but there would be also lots of landscape features that appear to be nondescript. And then we went to the 3 oak trees, and then we went to the two ash trees, and it's like, and then you get into this debate of, yes. So does this mean that there were only oak trees here? And the logical answer, no. Why would that mean? Because then they would not be able to recognize the oak trees later on, and the whole thing would lose its point. I don't know the answer. I was going to, I'll do it at some point, and I'll take late perambulations, let's say 17th or 18th century, where I know both the perambulation and the precise species composition of the woodland that they were marching next to.
I see.
Now compare them. See if they were choosing the obvious tree or the non-obvious tree. The logical answer would be they would be choosing the special tree that's not in the rest, but I don't know actually. I'll do that at some point. Yes.
I mean, just an interesting aside question. I mean, can you actually go to places and be able to look at a tree and say, oh, that's a very nice 12th century tapwood oak or something?
12th century? Yeah, even that is possible. There are tens of thousands of medieval trees in Europe. Unfortunately, most of it is in England and in Greece. Yes, I mean around here, not too many. No. I mean a 500-year-old tree is not an exception. An oak is happy to live for 1,000 years, or we actually don't really know how long. I mean, if the conditions are right, and trees live very long, so no problem. You can find medieval landscapes. Well, it is almost grown into business proportions to do perambulations in the ground. So you take the perambulation, you take a map, and you go and follow everything on the ground. You take pictures and then you document it on the internet, whatever you want. A lot of people do this. Not so much in Hungary, but the potential, for example, in Hungary is great. I've done a few perambulations myself, and you can really if you don't understand the document, it's because you're not there.
I see.
Once you're there, and I mean, and it's providing it's not a brown coal mine or something nowadays, but a reasonably similar landscape, you will be able to orientate yourself.
I think it's Eastern Poland. There's that one prime forest that's advertised as the primeval forest.
Białowieża, yes, I know.
Oh, I cannot pronounce Polish.
Oh, I can't either. I have a good friend there who does the history of the site. Mm-hmm. It's called Tomáš Samoilik, and yeah, he always laughs at my accent.
When people talk in the documents, about an oak tree or a lime tree or things like that, did they see these sort of species the same way that we would see them?
Oh, species. Species is a very problematic concept. They had no idea of species as such. That's Linnaeus. Centuries later,
yes.
Who made up species? No, you see, there's some debate about whether if they say oak, is it really an oak? I don't see the point in questioning their ability to tell an oak from a lime. I don't think they will be able to tell a Quercus robur from Quercus petrea, is two species of oaks,
right.
The sessile and the pedunculate oak. But actually, the species concept is not. I mean, it doesn't quite work the way we like to think it does. With oaks, for example, if you get an older species in a relatively intact place, it's very often very difficult to say what species it is, because they refuse to fit into the species concept very often. I mean, with some species it does work, but for example with oaks it doesn't really work. So in that sense, their view of nature is about as precise as ours. We just pretend we know more, but don't really. I have a nice description it's from a little book published in 1600. It's about perambulations, written by a Czech person who was basically the highest official in the country at that point, responsible for perambulations, and he wrote this guide. Basically, this is how you do it, okay? And he has a section on oaks. These are the kind of oaks, and it's fascinating. I did show it to botanists, and they really had no idea what to do with it. There are lots of terms in it, even it's written in Czech, but there are Latin names, and some of those names do fit the modern terminology, but they refer to something completely different. It's something completely different, and also there are descriptions, how you can tell these trees apart, and that's something very, very different from what a botanist would look for. But it seems to be a valid description. I would be able to tell which is which.
Well, fair enough. We're going to take a short break for now, but please enjoy the music. We'll be back momentarily. Welcome back. I'm Christopher Mielke, and joining us today is Dr. Péter Szabó from the Czech Academy of Sciences. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Once again, it's a pleasure to be here.
So, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is going back to the title of the monograph, Woodlands and Forests. I mean, Woodlands and Forests, before I picked up the book, it sort of seemed like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but is there a significant difference between the two?
In some regions there is, and that was kind of, one of the topics of that book. I mean, there are 2 words for a start, so one would expect some sort of a difference. And the difference is, although it's a very, very complicated subject, so depending on the region and on the period, woodland is the place where you would expect trees. A forest is a place where you might find trees, but you don't have to. A forest, at least in the medieval interpretation, comes from foris. It is outside, and the way they understood it, that it's outside common law. It's an area that is set aside from common law for the king. He wouldn't go there and do the hunting himself, but it's basically professionals who would do the hunting. But the point is that it's originally, the word forest has very little to do with vegetation. It's a legal concept. Now, how the 2 things came to mean, how the 2 words came to mean the same thing, is a very complicated story. And there are 2 problems with it. We don't really know the beginning, and we don't really know the end. The middle we have a relatively good idea about.
Oh, okay.
The beginning is... I wonder if we ever find out anything reasonable about it, because it's the concept we know is Merovingian. The first time the word itself, forestum, in various forms appears is Merovingian, 7th century. So it's a difficult period to find out what things mean exactly, especially as far as the landscape is concerned. I haven't really done this myself, but now I did for a book that is called the Environmental History. I actually don't know the exact title, but it's going to be a series of 3 books about the environmental history of the Middle Ages, written by a number of people, and I was now responsible for high medieval woodland. And so I had a look at the forests as well, because this high Middle Ages is when the concept is the clearest. But I had to go back to the beginning a little bit, and it was very difficult. It's not only I know very little about Merovingian and Carolingian times, but the whole issue seems to be very complicated. Also, different territories will have different stories, and then there is some sort of a clearer picture in the High Middle Ages. Once again, this disintegrates into something in the later Middle Ages, in the early modern period. But once again, as many stories as there are countries or regions. So,
a basic question for the listeners back home. I mean, the most famous medieval forest is, of course, Sherwood Forest. And it's kind of interesting to think that, every single movie has Sherwood Forest, with all of these gigantic trees. And, there would have definitely been deer in Sherwood Forest.
Yes. Oh, Sherwood Forest, we happen to know that,
okay.
was about 1/5 wooded in the Middle Ages, which is not that much.
No, that's not at all.
Now, where they shoot the Robin Hood films usually... where I know for sure they did the last one. Well, was it the last one? For me, the last one. I'm old enough. The last one I saw with Kevin Costner, that was in a place next to London called Burnham Beeches.
Oh, okay.
That's not a forest at all. It's a wooded common where certain people had rights to do certain things, and the wonderful trees, the beech trees, result from something called pollarding. It's a combination that would happen a lot in forest as well. I don't know about Sherwood, but Epping Forest, for example, near London, or the New Forest. You do this when you have to combine grazing animals and trees. You can't cut the trees and let the animals go in, because they would eat everything that grows, and very soon you will end up with a pasture. So you have a problem. What you can do is you cut your trees kind of 2 or 3 meters above the ground. They'll be happy to grow there. You'll have some wood left, and the animals can graze whatever is left. That's why the trees are so old. This, for biological reasons, probably not much point in going into them, but this prolongs the life of a tree. A tree is not a person. Anthropogenic kind of ideas will not work for a tree. So if you want to have an old tree, you will have to cut it a lot. That's when you get an old tree. So the trees in Burnham Beeches, where they do the Robin Hood movie, are about 500 years old, most of them. And they are that old because they were cut repeatedly with this method. Now later on, the place, pasturing stopped, and the place got infilled. Little trees started growing up everywhere, and now it looks like a wood. But historically it's not a wood, and it's never been a forest.
Right. There was a brilliant team of excavators for the city of Novgorod in Russia, and one of the things that they noticed is that in a fairly sizable city, there was a lot of meadow on main avenues in and out of the cities, and essentially it was places for the horses to feed.
Okay.
And it's sort of interesting how we have these conceptions and we don't think about. I mean, pollarding is a very practical thing for a tree. Having meadows in cities is a very practical thing. I mean, it's essentially like medieval gas stations. You might think of it that way,
I guess.
And then one other thing that also really impressed me was how, like, the care taken, how to get the most bang for your buck when dealing with the trees. You'd have the if I remember correctly, there were the maiden trees that grew very tall. There were the pollard trees, which it prolonged the life of the tree, but that you could use the smaller sticks for firewood, for instance. And it just really consistently impressed me. The more I learned, the more I think that there was a very very practical and pragmatic way of dealing with the best way with the resources that you had.
I suppose, yes. That's one of the things that we're finding out now in woodland management. That it's no novelty if you say that medieval agriculture, especially high medieval agriculture, was relatively developed business. They had their field systems and all that, but not a long time ago. Still, people would think that yes, all that, but then the forests, and they were all wild, and they went there, and I don't know what, and we wouldn't suppose, people wouldn't bring woodland management to the same level, at least theoretically or possibly, as the management of the rest of the landscape. We hear about water meadows, which are very, very complicated systems of irrigating meadows and all that. But the woodland, until very recently, was all kind of, that's the rest, and it was like they didn't know what to do with it and all that. But we're finding out gradually it's not at all true. Woodland management was as careful, as complicated as normal agriculture. And I think it's pretty natural if you look at it that way, that it's every single piece of the landscape was managed. So why not woodland?
One question I have, since we're talking about the way this was managed, were different types of trees used in different ways?
It's easy to say that this kind of certain trees were needed for certain purposes, but if you're out in the countryside, you want to be as little picky as it is possible, because you don't really have an option. Trees are relatively particular about where they grow. So if you need to do certain things and you don't get the tree that you think you should have, you have a problem. You have to bring it from somewhere else. So you want to be not picky. What would happen is there are two basic uses. We can forget about the very, very specialized uses. If you want to build this kind of ship, then you need that kind of tree in this kind of shape. Okay, but how many ships can you build? Let's be honest. I did some calculating, and other people as well, and you can build all the ships that have ever existed from a very, very small forest. Believe me, it is not very important. The important things are two: firewood and building timber. You have to build houses, although they can last long. And for the firewood, it seems, that's the stuff you burn, they didn't really care, whatever. Of course, we know, and they also knew, I'm sure, that different species of tree have different heating value. You burn this, you'll get a nicer fire, hotter fire. But they didn't really care. They just cut whatever they found, and they were happy with. Now, for the building timber, that's a different issue, because of two things, probably. First is in certain positions or for certain types of constructions, it's really nice to have, for example, oak, which wouldn't rot, whereas other trees would. Or you can't build Venice on I don't know what, spruce trees, because it'll sink very quickly. You need a certain kind of tree that will stay in the water and not rot. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, and the other thing is prestige, of course, because building timber in some periods, in some places, is visible and is meant to be visible. So you want to get usually the expensive kind of tree, so that everybody can see that you can afford it.
What sort of trees were very high status or expensive? Oak, that makes sense.
Oak is building timber is, I don't know the numbers, of course, everywhere, but it's 90% of building timber in places where oak would grow. Not in northern Sweden. It tends to be oak. Where you get oak, that'll be the building timber. at least for constructions. Once again, making houses is a complicated business. So
you mentioned, the fact that spruce rots. For trees like that, would they be used in any particular way if they couldn't be used for housing?
You can make a perfectly good house from a spruce tree. You just shouldn't make it in Venice.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Were there any particular woods type of wood that was considered really low status or even taboo, or was it just sort of anything goes?
For building purposes, or in general, or
let's say in general.
My people, the people I deal with, are very practical people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there existed places where you wouldn't want to go, taboo, the sacred, I don't know what, but I deal with the peasants. They didn't really care. I mean, in my sources, there are no forbidden forests.
Hogwarts would be so disappointed.
Oh, well, I know. That's a different kind of landscape perception, I suppose. In my sources, there are only settlements, very well-defined fields, very well-defined forests where you go and do this and that. And I deal with the practicalities. I don't really know about the mentalities.
Well, and I think the source material itself is practical in nature.
Yes.
We'll take a very short break, but we'll be back momentarily. Please enjoy the music. Welcome back. This is Christopher Mielke, and joining us today is Dr. Péter Szabó. We've been talking a lot about very general aspects of trees, forests, woodlands, etc. One of the things that I wanted to ask you in this particular portion is a little bit about some of the specific case studies that you've worked on. You've done a lot of research on woodlands and forests in Hungary and, from what I understand, in Bohemia as well. Would you mind telling us a little bit about sort of some of the interesting things that you've encountered looking at the material?
Most of the more particular case studies I've done more recently in the Czech Republic, Moravia, that's the eastern half, and there were some interesting places there. Usually the more interesting places for me are those that kind of stand as islands in a sea of agricultural landscape. This is not the usual kind of attitude. People who like forests or woodlands, they tend to like kind of larger pieces of woodland in the mountains or somewhere. But I'm fascinated by these smaller places. And because they're small, they tend to be significant in the landscape. And this has two consequences. They change little because they were rare and expensive and protected as a result. That's one thing. And the other thing, and that, of course, that's connected, they tend to have good documentation. If you have a huge tract of woodland somewhere, usually the documentation will not be quite that good because it was not interesting or rare enough to be written about all that much. There are, of course, many exceptions, but in general. So my favorite would tend to be in southern Moravia, which is a very agricultural landscape, relatively flat, only relatively. And now recently, of course, I have transformed myself into a topic person rather than a period person. Once you're a medievalist, I mean, you define yourself by a period.
Oh, sure,
and then there are different topics. Nowadays, I define myself as a topic person. I'm a historical ecologist for whatever that means, and so I'm not driven by documents from a single period. So I'm looking at these places from the earliest documentation, which might be medieval, up until the present, and I cooperate with the ecologists who work on current vegetation, and I also cooperate with the paleoecologists who work with the past that is much longer than what we usually work with in medieval studies. So, for example, there is a place, a small wood. Nowadays, the protected part is about 300 hectares. The historical part is 220. It's called Děvín. Anybody who's ever near Brno, is where I live, should go and take a look at this place. It's a wonderful little, it's a flat landscape, and out of that flat landscape comes this kind of hill. It's about 500 and something meters high. It's a little bit like Ayers Rock in Australia, a little bit. Okay, I mean, don't get too excited, but it's a very nice place. And it's got excellent documentation because it's rare, and also because of ownership. It was always part of a large estate, and the estate ownership was very conservative. It only had basically two owners from the Middle Ages. First the Liechtenstein and then the Dietrichstein family. This is, of course, the ex-German speaking part of the country.
I see.
And there the documentation starts in the late 14th century, and there's a lot of it up until the 20th century. So I know that there was a lot of stability in woodland management. The place was managed the same way for at least 650 years, exactly the same way, only the cutting cycle got longer. They were cutting it less frequently, but exactly the same way up until the mid-20th century, where everything changed, and now there was at least nature conservation who say don't touch anything. That's not natural. Of course, this is nonsensical in this case, but now they're changing their mind a little, so maybe we'll get management back. And of course, on top of the hill, there's a Bronze Age fortification, and right next to the hill, there's a very significant Paleolithic site, archaeological, so who knows how long the management has been the same. My idea would be at least 3,000 years. Of course, I might be very wrong, but that's how I would imagine it.
You said it's owned by these two families, presumably noble families. Yes. And my question, though, is that they're owned by these families, so with this little island wood surrounded by a bunch of agriculture, was it something that, was used for the purposes of the estate, or was it something that local people used?
That changes. And that's a general trend we see not only here, we see it all over Europe. In the Middle Ages, even in the late Middle Ages, wood is good business. You cut it, you sell it. It's firewood we're talking about. Construction timber is also good business, but you never get enough of it. And anyway, you will have to give to your peasants whose their house is burnt down last year. So what will you do? You won't let them just be homeless. That's not going to work. You have to give them the timber that they need. So you won't get that much. It's firewood we're talking about, but firewood is very, very good business in the Middle Ages. In this place that I'm talking about, in this estate, in the 14th century, 1/4 of the whole income was coming from firewood sales as a lot. Every fourth forint, which they didn't have, of course, came from woodland sales. This is what they were doing. Very, very intensive management, making a lot of money out of it. Now, this changes also in other places by the early modern period, by which time you keep your money somewhere else. It's all over. This is not so interesting anymore. What you would do is you would let your peasants or tenants, depending on the system, come in and take the firewood they want. They would do it themselves. You would write a contract. So you do this, you pay this and that much money, and you'll be okay. And you keep the construction timber for yourself. It would be more in a kind of closed system. You wouldn't be selling all that much anymore. Which is interesting. I mean, it is the Middle Ages, we're taught. There is kind of a self-contained system that they would produce everything they needed and not much commerce and all that. But in this case, it's clearly the other way around.
Right. It's a commodity that so many people need. So I could see how having a well-managed wooded area could be very profitable.
There comes a period when it stops to be economically profitable. You would be interested in fish because it pays more.
Is there any reason for that? Or just
I'm not an economic historian. I think it's got its own reason. Simply, if you have a fish pond, you can make 10 times more money than from a woodland. So you would want to have a fish pond, invest your energy into that one, and just not care so much about the money that you can get from your woodlands. Now you
have them, right?
That doesn't mean anything in terms of management. For example, management we know, for example, at this place was always the same. It's just the financial economic conditions have changed a lot around it.
I have a question that came to mind, and do with it what you will, but for me there's, in maybe late medieval and early modern representations of the landscape, usually I'm thinking of city maps, but that probably wouldn't be such a good source of info, but city maps or general maps of a certain region, they'll depict trees as part of the landscape, either, usually in the hinterlands, like outside of the city walls, etc., etc. Are these reliable sources of information, in your opinion, on issues related to woodlands and forestry, or is it more of an artistic trope?
Oliver Rackham, who's the most famous person in my topic, is the father of the whole thing, wrote repeatedly that it's surprising how few artists are able to paint recognizable trees. Most probably, he says, is because a tree is such a complex thing that to pick out the features that you need to be able to recognize that tree, that's an extremely difficult thing. You really have to know the tree, to know what to look for. Mm-hmm. It's not only late medieval and early modern, much, much later. And that's also true. Usually you get a painting, 17th, 18th century, you get the tree and you have no idea what kind of tree that is. I am not a botanist, so my opinion is not necessarily all that valid, but this is just what happens. So in city maps and all that, the trees and the landscape is usually very generalized. They painted a generic tree. There was the bushy top tree, yes, and then the tree with the kind of the little leaves, or I don't know. I mean, sometimes you do see a nice painting where you can see, okay, I can see that's an oak because it's got the very characteristic leaves, or that's an ash because of the leaves and the pattern of the leaves, but that's very, very rare. And as far as landscapes are concerned, they didn't really. I mean, they just wanted to paint a background.
I'd imagine it might even be more important to be like, here are the 3 most important churches in the city. Yes. Here's the road system. More important considerations, perhaps.
Well, as Gerhard Jaritz was telling us often, that whenever you see such a thing in a medieval piece of art, it's meant to have a meaning.
Well.
And that meaning is not, the purpose is not depicting any sort of landscape. The point is to convey a certain message. There is one painting, though, medieval, I think. Once again, it's famously quoted by Rackham. The single painting, he says he knows, that depicts a recognizable medieval wood. If you look at it, yes, you can recognize the trees. There are many interesting features that come with woodland management. They're all there. Even in the foreground, you can recognize certain species in the vegetation. It was painted by a Dutch master, if I'm not mistaken. So they were capable of doing it. They were just not so much interested.
And just a final question before we cut to the small break. Are there any forests in Bohemian Hungary that you feel really need further study?
Oh, a lot.
Oh, okay.
Of course. Well, I mean, woodland history was in vogue in the first half of the 20th century in a certain kind of fashion that we don't like too much nowadays. It had a certain kind of agenda, but nonetheless, the material they gathered is valuable. The work they did was huge, so we need to appreciate that. But after the 1950s, 60s, 70s, maybe it all stopped, and not much was going on for decades. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Okay, well, we'll take a short break. We'll be back momentarily. Welcome back. This is Christopher Mielke, your host of Past Perfect, and today we've had a very good interview with Péter Szabó from the Czech Academy of Sciences. And before we finish off with our program, I wanted to ask about your current work and sort of, what you're working on right now.
I'm working on a larger project financed by the European Research Council. It's about long-term woodland dynamics in Central Europe. You can check it out, by the way, if you're interested. It's the www.longwood.cz. It's a Czech website. Well, it's a larger project, as I said. Involves interdisciplinary research by a number of people from various disciplines. Paleoecologists, GIS specialists, historians, archaeologists, botanists, vegetation ecologists. I hope I didn't forget anyone. Working on long-term woodland dynamics in Moravia, which is about, 23,000 square kilometers. It's a fairly large region. And we're building a geodatabase, a GIS. We're feeding lots of data into it from various sources. The data is very heterogeneous, obviously. Vegetation ecologists have very different data from historians. Palynologists have very different data from archaeologists. But fortunately now GIS exists, and the technology makes it possible to connect all these things and ask various questions once you're ready. Now we're a year and a half into the project, so we don't have that much data, but it's coming on, and also some publications are coming out. So I think in general, the project's looking up. So we'll see
very interdisciplinary project, and it sounds fantastic. Dr. Szabó, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much.
And for the listeners back home, we thank you very much for listening as well. Be sure to tune in on our website at www.medievalradio.org. Be sure to send us an email at medievalradio@ceu.hu, and be sure to like us on Facebook as part of our 1 Million Medievalists campaign. We thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.